look to your word to know and understand you better, and to understand what it means to be a child of God, and that we to be a follower. We're thankful, Father, for this time we have that's quiet, safe, comfortable. We're just thankful for those things. We ask that you be with us this evening in your Son's name. Amen. So we're still in Deuteronomy, and we're going to be there, I think, a while until Oliver kicks me off. So I've asked everyone to do a lot of reading, and that's great. I don't know how far you've gotten, whether you have gotten through the whole book, whether you've just kind of gotten through our first 11 chapters or even farther. Whichever and whatever you've done for your reading, I hope that it's been beneficial. We started this class in the idea that we want to know the surroundings, we want to know who's speaking and those kind of things. We've gone over that, but we're going to continue to remind ourselves of that, because not just Deuteronomy and not just the Old Testament, but we all know the scriptures get twisted, and we don't want to be guilty of that. We want to make sure that we're getting what is intended out of the scriptures so that we can understand what God's character is and what he has done for his children. Our study is not, like we talked about at the beginning, is not facts and figures necessarily. We're not going to march through it like what we have in the others, which have been very beneficial and very helpful. With Deuteronomy, our march would be long, and our march would be labor intensive. There's lots of things in there that we can learn, because most of the time we shun away from things like Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and some of the others, because it seems like it's not applicable to us. We don't read the Old Testament like we read the New Testament. We look at the New Testament, we go, oh, that relates to me because it's in Christ. I see those terminologies, I see those things, I can relate to those things. In the Old Testament, we don't tend to do that as much, simply because of our perspective and our viewpoint. We need to maybe break that and be more open to understanding 2/3 of the scriptures are in the Old, if you will, Testament. And if we discard that and say, boy, that just doesn't, all of these ceremonies, all of these rules and regulations in our perspective, and we just toss those aside, and the prophecies and the prophets and even the Psalms and even Proverbs sometimes we toss aside, saying, it doesn't have anything to do, I don't understand the terminology, I don't understand what they're talking about, and so we move on. We should not do that. We should always look to the scriptures, no matter in what period it is in and who is speaking. It has something to do with what God had intended. So our study is in regards to God's character and his relationship to his people. We say, what has it got to do with us? Paul has a nice dissertation in chapter 10 in 1 Corinthians in regards to that. The main pull verse out of that is verse 11, which these things happened to them as examples, as they were written down as a warning to us, for whom the accumulation of the ages has come. Love to go back and study that phrase right there, this idea of accumulation of ages. We are, in a sense, related to the Old Testament. This, God has brought the seed from Genesis chapter 3 and has brought that through Christ, and we are related in that regard, in that we are now God's children as well. Our path has been different, but it is also similar. And if there is a portion of scripture that just doesn't appear to be relevant to us, we need to stop, reread that, rethink that, and see that it is what is it telling us about God? We're going to look through in the next couple of weeks. We'll probably bump into all of these rules and regulations and feasts and what do you do with blood, and how do you eat meat, and how do you bury somebody, and how do we react as Christians to death, and so forth and so on. And it may seem like it just doesn't mean anything to us. But we need to step back and say, what is that telling us about God's character? We've seen already that God watches over his children and has, even in their disobedience, taken care of them. Sir?
All I was going to say is there's one thing we should always keep in mind. God preserved the Old Testament for us for a reason.
For a reason, absolutely. And whether it's us now, it's us in the 1800s, it's us 2000 and whatever we make it to, or 3000, it is the same, and that is to see his glory. From the April 26th class, I missed something in that I said at the end that as a part of homework, if you will, is to go and as you're reading is look at and identify, underline it, color it, however you want to mark it, as we go through our study, what God is how and when is God taking care of his people. And we see that over and over and over again, and we could take 3 or 4 weeks just looking at those things. But just have an eye for that when God does take care of his people. Some of our examples, how do we know that he took care of his people? What are some of the examples we've already run into? Manna, water. Clothes didn't wear out. Some of us wouldn't like the idea that we don't wear one pair of shoes, but it didn't wear out. Well, how else? He took care. His hand was in the battle when he said, "Go take the land." Wasn't he with them when they did that? They were outnumbered. There are any number of things. They were big people, right? And yet God was with them. How else? When they left Egypt. Anything else? I know we're not hitting all of them, but just a couple of examples. Provided spiritual food. Okay? All right? In chapter 5, we looked at this idea. We began to see this more in this idea of fear. It says, "Oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me." In our day, that's an unusual statement because we tend to think of fear as a bad thing. And we attach fear to being something bad, but that's not the case. We talked about and asked, we're going to look at that in a few minutes, as a homework is go find this idea of fear of the Lord and see if that plays out or if there's something different here. In chapter 6, same thing, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, and by keeping, how do I fear him? By keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, so that, there's a benefit here to fearing the Lord. You may enjoy long life. And then again in chapter 6, the Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as in the case today. So this idea of fear of the Lord is very different in the scriptures than it is in our society and how we see fear. We also didn't get to talk much in chapter 7 about this idea of being chosen people, because this is very important for us. I think we know that in principle. We've heard this before, but for us to connect to this is important. This shows us God's character. God picked out the Israelites because they were beautiful people. Is that right? He picked them because they were the most obedient. He picked them out because they were very nice.
If we'd been picking people, we wouldn't have picked Israel.
Okay?
Fortunately, it's God that's picked.
Absolutely. Why did he pick Israel?
He loves them.
Loves them. Let's take a look at that. But because the Lord loved you, a little bit about verse 8, and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of the Pharaoh king of Egypt. It's not that he just loved them. Our God keeps his commands and he keeps his covenant. If God did not keep his covenant, I dare say we would not get picked either, because we sin the same and we have the same struggles. We're good and then we're bad and we struggle every day. Yet God is patient and he has made a covenant with us and he is faithful. I break it, others break it, but he is faithful, even when I break that covenant. So know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands or commandments. This idea of 1,000 here is a very powerful word in Hebrew, in that 1,000 represents a lot. We see billions and billions of dollars going to whatever. We use big numbers because of finances. We use big numbers because of science or whatever. But in their day, 1,000 is a lot. And it represents, for example, there's a psalm that talks about there are 10,000 angels. There's 10,000 angels. It's not kind of where I was going, but that's good. Cattle. There's 10,000 cattle on the hills. That is like milk and honey. It represents, it's a picture of something, and that is prosperity. And so 1,000 is a very important word. So we want to talk about this idea of fear. The Hebrew words are very different than ours. Anybody a Hebrew scholar? Yeah, me either. So I got to go look this stuff up all the time. So anytime I bring it up, it's not because I'm smart, it's because that I got resources, so I go look at those resources. But this idea of fear, it is pronounced Yah-Re. It means two basic things. Though if you go to the Strongs and go to Thayer's and go to a couple others, you'll see that there is a plethora of sub-ideas in regards to this idea of fear. But there's two basic ones. We stand in awe, stand in fear. We have reverence. And then the altar is to be fearful, to be frightened, to be scared, to cause astonishment and awe, to have inspired reverence, godly fear and awe. An example is if an enemy had just appeared, we would use the word Yah-Re to mean fear and astonishment. So they can coexist even within the same sentence in that regard. Who fears God will refrain from doing things that would be displeasing to him, the things that would make himself unworthy in God's regard. Fear of God does not make men shrink from him, and as one would from a tyrant or a wild beast. It draws them nearer to him and fills them with reverential awe. This fear, which is merely self-regarding and unworthy, is unworthy of a child of God. According to the Jews, who were, what did Paul say? They were entrusted with the oracles of God in Romans 3. The fear of the Lord means reverential awe. It doesn't describe the fear that makes you run from danger. It describes the reverential awe that you would have towards God. Or in a way of saying we don't, with fear of the Lord, we would have more inclined to run to God than running away from God. So we see the difference there in regards to that. So, how many went out there and tried to look up the phrase fear of the Lord, or tried to go find? Did you find some?
I looked into some commentaries.
Okay.
Some ideas. Yeah.
And
The one that really stands out to me, I don't know if it's like being a parent, but kind of like what you were describing. Like it's almost like you fear letting him down. It's that because you want to please him, you love him. Almost, the parent-child. Like the child fears letting their parent down. So when you say you run to them, kind of what makes me think of that.
okay.
Fear of, again, if you really love him, you won't want to disappoint him.
Okay.
You do, but
Yeah, and then we feel, and then we regret that, and then we need to repent from that and all those kind of things. But yes, that's a good one. Anybody else? Just go and look those phrases up.
Well, just from the phrase itself, and I use the New King James, so I try to find phrases all the time, but that's used 106 times
Okay.
in the New King James. So it's a very common saying or phrase.
Okay. Excellent. Anything else? Anybody else? Do any study on that? You can kind of see there's a few verses. This is not all of them. In regards to just the Old Testament, but there's one in the New Testament that Paul uses. So if you want to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and then we'll move on. This part and now we're in the New Testament, now we're across the cross, now we are on the right side of the Bible, however you want to phrase that. And Paul is writing to the Corinthians in regards to them being ministers of reconciliation. And it's very similar. Remember who he was? Remember Paul, where he came from? How he was educated? He was called a what? Pharisee among Pharisees. He had heritage. He had all sorts of that kind of training. So this is familiar territory for him. So as he's trying to teach the Corinthians, this is the last part of the area. I just wanted you to turn there, so when you want to take the time, just go read on each side of him and how he talks about this idea of ministry of reconciliation. But he says, since then, we know what it is to fear the Lord. And that's my question for us to think about. Do we know the fear of the Lord? Do you know the fear of the Lord? Is it different now than it was last week, when we really may not have known the exact reason or the exactness of this phrase? We try to persuade others. Do we try to persuade others because hell is coming, or do we try to persuade others because we know the benefits of fearing the Lord? That changes our perspective when we are out there wanting to share the gospel. If we look at what the good things are from God that comes from nowhere else, I'm much more motivated to go teach the gospel that I would like them to fear the Lord as well. What we are is plain to God, and I hope that it is also plain in your conscience. So Paul's trying to get this same idea across. We missed chapter 7 a little bit. I didn't get to really focus in on that very much, but I do want to take a look at this. This is where it talks about, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, his treasured possession. He did not set his affection on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. but it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out of the mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery. Edward Bear has a great statement. We've talked about it before, and it's his statement. I just like it. I like the quote. Since God is what he is, since he has done what he has done, and said what he has said, Israel must bring its attitudes and life into harmony with the will of God if the people are to live and prosper in the world. And you could substitute that with us. Because if we do the same thing, we try, we work hard, we want to do those things, but we would have the same benefits. And I got that one in twice, maybe 3 times. Moses' second speech, that's where we're at right now. Remember, we talked about 3 sections, 3 basic speeches, 3 different directions. What we're kind of looking at, the first 4 verses, first 4 through 1 through about 440-ish in there is looking back. We wonder, why is Moses doing that? We know that it was because he has a new audience. He has a new set of peoples. And so he's retelling that for a reminder. We constantly have to have a reminder. Even, and it gets worse when you get old, but we always have to be reminded how good God is, how much he watches over us, how much he takes care of us, how much he pays attention to us. As Jesus said, down to the very hairs on your head, he's not watching me very well. So, but unless it's in my ears. Yes, sir.
Before we go any further, the question comes to my mind about why he loves them so much, because the Old Testament seems to always say that, or demonstrate how they disappointed God.
So the question is, why does he love the Israelites? Sir?
I don't think it's so much how much he loves the Israelites. It's how much he loves his creation and mankind. And he has a plan that he's going to succeed.
Okay. That he loves mankind in general, and he has a plan, and that plan needs to be fulfilled.
Well, he's got this plan for mankind since before creation.
Okay.
He knew where it was going. I mean, it wasn't an accident. It didn't just happen.
But why not the Canaanites? Why not one of the other ites? I think is kind of in the direction his question is why the Israelites?
Because God's a faithful God and he made the promise to Abraham.
Okay. That's one part.
Their sins were full. That's why Israel went in and took.
That's a whole, yeah. And that's a different conversation, but just the idea that he picks the Israelites, he has a promise. He's fulfilled that. Remember, he keeps his covenant. But here is the second greater question. It's why. The answer is he loved them. But why? Because he loved them. And sometimes, why? For all of those who've had the 2-year-olds, right? Why? Because I said so as dad, right? That's my kingdom. But why? And sometimes it's hard for us to understand and really understand why he picked the Israelites.
Isaiah 55:8 and 9. We don't think like God.
We don't.
Not think like us.
But that's a good question because it helps us understand the character of God. He picks the Israelites. We don't know all that's going on in God, for God's plan, but we do know that he did. And on the other side is I'm grateful that he did, because then his plan was continued in place. Does that help a little bit?
Makes me think that maybe it was centered around Abraham
Mm-hmm.
And the rest who were not quite as faithful to God. You see that Abraham was.
Okay. Thing is, Abraham had his struggles, didn't he? A lot. Same with Moses. Moses, we see Moses with all of those things, but Moses had some struggles as well. He's kept out of the promised land because of his particular struggles. God didn't show him favor either. So, but that's a good question for us to, it's not necessarily, if we don't know that answer when we get to heaven, then we don't get to get in. I don't think it's one of those, but it's a very good question to understand God's character. And it's encouraging because if these folks and God stayed with them, if we all know the basic story of the Israelites, I got a chance because I'm just like them. How often does Moses tell the children that are there, tells the people there, pay attention, obey, all those things, and what do they do? They take a step across the river and everything's good, and they never sin again. No. How quickly do they fall away? Just about. It's pretty close. So that's a great question. So let's talk about worship. Let's go to chapter 12 for just a moment. We didn't have, that's why I'm going to ask Oliver for maybe a week or two more. How many read chapter 12 by any chance? Good. What is chapter 12? And if you haven't, just go through and look through. Most Bibles have little headers and all those kind of things. But what is chapter 12 about?
Destroying the idolaters that are in them.
Okay. What else? What else is chapter 12, and actually 13? But what is chapter 12 about? Okay. Following God's direction. Here's our jealous God, isn't it? Isn't he right here? Isn't he jealous right here? What does he say? No. Right, and I'm it. That's how our humanity kind of takes that. But God is very jealous that he's the only one that needs, that should have this worship from them. He is so jealous in that regard, and to us today, that he gives us very specific things for them to do, very specific things for where they do that, and very specific things on how they do that. And when, absolutely. Now, we are bringing with us, remember the festivals and the sacrifices and those things, and those are done in this area. This is a very good chapter to understand where do we see the church here? The physical piece of worship. We don't. It doesn't say everyone stand in a line, or it doesn't say, there's lots of those kind of things that we do out of tradition and out of convenience. And those are not wrong or bad. But for us to understand the idea of worship better, if we read through this as the Hebrew, how does this position me before God? Okay? Charlie? No? Oh, come on. You had a question mark on your head. No? Chapter 12, verse 1. These are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land of that the Lord your God, your ancestors, has given you to possess as long as you live in the land. How long do they do this? As long as they're in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, under every spreading tree, where the nations you are disposing worship their gods. Break down all the altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. Is that what we do today? Are we commanded to do that today? Why not?
This is a specific place that they were going into, specific people with instructions, but we are commanded not to put anything before God, not to have any idols.
Okay.
But in the general sense, in the specific sense, he was telling them about promises.
Okay. Absolutely. Their fight, if you will, was very physical in a lot of senses. When they walked into this land, these folks have been here a while. They have taken advantage and have set up all of these altars and so forth. It's not the altars, it's not the idol, not the idols. It is the influence of those idols that is the struggle. Our idols, we still have idols. We still struggle with idols, don't we?
Yes. Number one, me.
Me, myself, and I. I heard a phrase, this is not a part of the class, but I heard a phrase in regards to we love Jesus almost as much as we love ourselves. And that may be hard and it may be a little difficult to kind of work through, but it is true in humanity. They fall away, we fall away the same way. Most of the time, it's because I love me or what I like or what I want to do more than I love God. Do I say I do that? Absolutely. But do I do that? No. And if I'm not careful, I go down that path. It's not just, well, it's the TV or it's the sports team or it's the car or it's whatever. We struggle with those kind of idols all the time. Things become so important to us that we forsake the assembly because we want to go do those things, not be with the brothers and sisters. If you got to work on Sunday, yay for you, you have to do that. If somebody's sick, that's different. But when we make a conscious choice not to assemble with the brothers and sisters, that is something I've put in front of. I'm too tired. By the way, these are my excuses, so don't think it's personal. I'm too tired. I had a rough day yesterday. Sunday's my only day I really have to rest. The weather is great outside. I have those kind of struggles. And I've had those excuses in the past because I love me more than I love God. As we walk through chapter 12 and 13 and forward, keep that in mind. God is very jealous. He wants our attention and only to Him. And if I don't love Him that way, if I don't have that love, that fear of the Lord, I need some work. I've got to work on that. I've got to find how I can do that better. One other thing in here, if I can find it. He talks about in verse 4, you must not worship the Lord your God in their way. So these folks have been there. They're walking into this area. He is warning them not to do it the way they did. How is that similar for us today? Do we see the brotherhood? So we're going to just talk about brotherhood because we see the world doing that. We see the brotherhood find, oh, they created this or that, to attract those to come in. Yeah, I know it's not in the scriptures. Yeah, I know it's kind of flaky, but we'll attract the young people, or we'll attract the rich people, or we'll attract just the volume of people. And we do things like the world does. We have to be careful as the brotherhood to not have that frame of mind. We need to do things that are pleasing to God and that is worship to them. We don't want to adopt something from the outside just so that we feel better, or that it is a temptation for us to do that, isn't it? We want to have more people. We want to do this. We want to do that. But we don't want to go somewhere else and say, gee, aren't they successful? Look at that, 3,000 people. Well, it's okay if it's in Texas, because those are usually brothers and sisters. There are huge congregations down there in Texas. But when we have that desire that overrides our love for God to make the chairs full, we need to be very, very careful. And not just that, other things. So when he is warning them about these idols, and he's warning them about all the way they worship, it's the same warning to us. We just want to be careful in regards to that. How long? I got another minute or two. So let's go to verse 20 in chapter 12, because this is one place out of many that makes no sense to us. Verse 20, when the Lord your God has enlarged your territory as he promised, you crave meat and say, I would like some meat. Then you may eat as much as you want. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, you may slaughter animals from the herds and the flocks the Lord has given you, as I have commanded you, and in your own towns you may eat as much of them as you want. And he talks about the idea in verse 22, eat them as you would a gazelle or a deer, and both the ceremonially unclean and clean may eat. But you be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. What does that mean to us? We have meat. We have people that choose not to eat meat because we have so much meat. They didn't have meat. Meat's a luxury for them. They've been traveling in the desert. Meat, other than the quail, is scarce. There's two things to learn on this one, and it's God's character. God established some rules in regards to worship, festivals, and sacrifices, where everyone needed to come and gather to do that. However, and that was about 3 times a year, however, this is so big, the land is so large, I just can't get there from here. It's a burden to me to try to provide or go and do what I've been commanded. Here's God's care for his people. It's okay. I will give an exemption because I know it's hard in this case. And he gives them an opportunity to be able to do what they need to do to serve God. But they, in an everyday case, they don't have to continually go to one place or travel to one place. There's more to the traveling and such, but I just want to pick up the idea that God is caring about that detail. Just like one pair of shoes. We miss that sometimes in our reading. We miss God's care on the tiny things. We miss his care in regards to the people. And this idea of meat and blood, Homework for this week. Why is it bad for them to eat the blood? That's where the life is. But why? You only get to use that once, and one time only. Why? Scripturally, correct answer, but scripturally, how do we know that? How do we know that the blood is life? Homework for this week, go find out. Go look, go study, go try to find out. I don't know. I'll give you a star if you find the verses that get us there and help us all learn why that's the case. Because it's more than just not eating the blood. It has more to do with God's character and his watchfulness over his children as much as it is life. Thank you very much for the class. I appreciate it. Hopefully this is beneficial for you. And hopefully I can talk all over and you've given me a week or more. Maybe. He's not smiling, so maybe not. So we'll see. Thank you.